In this next episode of our Jerusalem from Genesis to Jesus series, we see archaeological evidence of Jewish captivity in Babylon and explore the time when the exiles returned to Jerusalem. By the rivers of Babylon, we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. This quote may be familiar to you. It comes directly from the book of Psalms and is a song birthed out of the Jewish longing to return to Jerusalem while exiled in Babylon. In the last episode of this series, we learned how Babylon destroyed Jerusalem and took the Jewish people captive to Babylon. But it wasn't too long before the Jewish people were permitted to return to Zion. But did they all want to return to Jerusalem? Or had they become comfortable where they were? Who returned? And is there any archaeological evidence that the Jewish people did come back to Jerusalem and attempt to rebuild its ruins? I invite you back in time, roughly 2,500 years, to explore this intriguing period in history, to learn about Jerusalem during the age of Ezra and Nehemiah, and to discover the passion for God's holy city that compelled the Jewish people home to rebuild their beloved Jerusalem. I can't imagine being a Jewish resident of Jerusalem when, in 586 BC, the armies of Babylon broke down her walls, burned Solomon's magnificent temple to the ground, and destroyed God's holy city. But while Jerusalem lay in ruins, the Jewish captives established themselves in Babylon and life went on. I've always been intrigued by this time in history, so when Danny informed me that there was archaeological evidence directly related to these Jewish captives on display at the Bible Lands Museum, I was excited to check it out. Well, Danny, we are here at the Bible Lands Museum in Jerusalem, right next to the Israel Museum. This is an amazing place, and this exhibit in particular is extremely fascinating from the time period of the Babylonian exile. What are we seeing here?
Yes, I really feel privileged that not only did we get a permit to film, they removed the glass. You can almost touch one of the most amazing, important, underrated chapters in Jewish history.
Yeah.
An archaeological discovery made somewhere in Iraq of today, a whole archive of Jews exiled to Babylon. You would think that they turned into slaves and so on. No, they settled. These documents record them as landowners, as bankers, giving loans, taking loans. Some of them even had slaves.
Now you talk about documents. What exactly do they call these?
Yeah, so this is not a Word file or an Excel. This is how they wrote documents in antiquity. They would take a wet piece of clay, and as it dries up, they would squeeze little or incise little symbols, perpendicular or horizontal or sideways. It's called a cuneiform, this type of writing. And luckily, unlike when you write on paper, this never rots or burns.
Right.
In fact, if there is a fire in the archive, it only bakes it to turn it into like pottery. It's harder. And then 2,500 years later, if you can read the language, and let's admit, only a few can today, you can read it very clearly.
It's amazing to think that they found these. It's certainly evidence of ongoing life and economy in exile in Babylon, which meant that the Jews weren't slaves, they were members of society essentially, right?
At least some of them.
Yes.
At least some of them. These record people accumulating property, accumulating wealth, and no wonder that when the Bible tells us that Persia takes over from Babylon and Cyrus, the king of Persia, tells the Jews, you know what, if you so badly want to return to your homeland in Jerusalem, go for it. Not everyone returns. Now you can understand why. They're doing quite well by the rivers of Babylon. Yes, the Bible tells us that they were yawning, they were praying to return. There's even a beautiful psalm about it.
Right.
By the rivers of Babylon. We even have the music, yes?
Yes.
But some of them may have sung it, but still favored to stay. And you know what? I even have a family connection. I'm not from Babylonian descent, but my wife is. So our children are carrying potentially some DNA of those Jews.
Amazing.
Only in 1948, as a result of the events of the 20th century, all the Jews of Iraq were kind of kicked out.
Yeah.
And most of them came here. One of them was my wife's mother.
Wow. Well, that's incredible. And I think what else is incredible is that the Bible, Jeremiah the prophet, actually talks about, gives instruction to the exiles in Babylon about what they should do while they're there.
Yes, it's an amazing document that fits so well with what these documents are telling us.
Yeah, it perfectly fits. Jeremiah 29, it's a text of the letter that the prophet Jeremiah sent from Jerusalem to the surviving elders in Babylon. And here's what it says. He gives them instruction: build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and increase in number. Do not decrease. And then he says, seek the peace and prosperity of the city. Be contributors to the society, essentially. And it goes on, that they should understand that there will be a 70-year period while they're there. And it says, eventually, God says, I will come to you and fulfill my good promise to bring you back to this place. And then there's a verse that Christians everywhere certainly love to quote for themselves. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. Words spoken by the prophet Jeremiah to the exiles in Babylon, a promise to them that they would return to Zion.
Yes. And before they returned, they settled over a vast area somewhere southeast of Baghdad. How do I know this? Because some of these tablets even have the place names. We could actually make a map over here that shows us more or less the distribution of the Jews in the area of southern Iraq of today. What an amazing documentation of that time frame Jeremiah is recording.
Absolutely.
And up to the return to Zion, which is recorded in the books of Israel and Nehemiah.
So amazing. Can we look at the map?
Yes. Yeah, Jeff, so here is a map suggesting the scale of distribution where the Jews settled in Babylonian exile. Okay, Baghdad is here, to the modern day Baghdad. Ancient Babylon is over here, so it's all southeast of that area, a fertile land where parts of the rivers of the Euphrates and the Tigris were passing. And you can imagine, a green irrigated field and various crops that they were living on. And yet, Babylon is taken by Cyrus, the Persian king, who tells the Jews, you can go back. And some do. That's the great return to Zion. But you can understand why some people favor to stay.
Right.
We have our living, our livelihood, and besides the distance. Listen, the Exodus, here is a map of the whole fertile crescent of the Middle East. The Exodus from Egypt to the Holy Land that took 40 years is this much.
Right.
What Nehemiah and Ezra were telling the people is you need to travel now all of this length to go back home. Whoa, no United Airlines, no train service. It's all on a donkey's back.
Yeah.
It's at least a month's walk to return to homeland. So I can understand why some of them favored to stay. And we have it recorded in the Bible, and we also now have some of those cuneiform tablets recording those people.
Danny, thank you so much for sharing that with us.
My pleasure. Oh, it's a great privilege to actually be able to document this place and getting this permission from the museum.
Yeah.
What an experience.
Don't go away. When we come back, I talk to Sandra Barris and see incredible archaeological evidence of the Jewish return to their homeland.
The nation of Israel and the Jewish people have just suffered horrendous attacks not seen since World War II. However, Israel and the Jewish people are not alone. First Century Foundations has been actively supporting the people of Israel for nearly 40 years, providing food, clothing, and shelter for those in need, especially in these desperate times. When you give a gift of $30 or more, you are not only helping support the people of Israel, you are also showing that you care and are blessing God's chosen people in their hour of need. And when you give your gift, as a thank you, you will receive the bi-monthly newsletter and Israel Prayer Watch. And for monthly donations, we will send you the book, Praying for the Peace of Jerusalem. Call now, 1-877-628-2800, or visit us online at firstcenturyfoundations.com and help the people of Israel during these dangerous times.
So, Israel doesn't stay in exile forever, and they never lose hope. I think that's the amazing thing about the story. They always are looking to Jerusalem, and it's true today even, I mean all around the world. But talk to us about the rebuilding of this nation after the destruction of the temple.
Well, I think there's a interesting progress that goes on while they're sitting in Babylon, okay? They come to Babylon, and we have, let's say, that wonderful psalm, you know, on the rivers of Babylon,
yeah.
right? And they're sitting in mourning. They're remembering Zion. And then we have Jeremiah saying to them, unpack your bags, start building houses. And it's kind of like a counter to the on the rivers of Babylon, because he's with a nation that really thinks, okay, we'll be here for 10 years. We'll be here for 5 years. We'll be here for 6 months, whatever. We're not going to settle. And Jeremiah says, no, you can be here for a while. You know, unpack your bags. But at the same time, Jeremiah promises them, after 70 years, you will return. Mm-hmm. And it's really after 70 years that they are returning to, you know, the land of Israel. And this, of course, we read about in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. And it's a wonderful story. And they come back. So you have the sense, on the one hand, that they, you know, they're yearning, they settle, they have this promise, but there's a downside of this, okay? First of all, if you go at the very beginning of the book of Ezra and you look at how many people came, and there's a list of these people who came to Israel, very few.
Yeah.
Now look at something else. You're going through the history, and again, this is in the book of Ezra. You're looking through the history and different kings, etc. And then they mention in the book of Ezra, there's one scripture that says, and in the time of Achashverosh, there were letters of hate written against the Jews of Judea. Well, what is that? That's the book of Esther. Which means that the whole book of Esther took place after Cyrus put forward his proclamation and allowed all the Jews to go up to Jerusalem. And what does the book of Esther tell us? That they didn't all go. Esther, her name was Hadassah. That's a Jewish name. She has an English name. She has not English, a Persian name, yes. Esther, which is Ishtar. It's a pagan name. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't think Esther was a pagan, but clearly, and Mordecai, Mordok. These were Persian names. Mordecai was a senior cabinet member in the court of Persia. How similar it is to today. We have today a wonderful state of Israel, and yet for some reason the Jews still all over the world, and they're in very high positions. There are Jews who are senior cabinet members of the presidents and prime ministers in the West, and they're not eager to come. And what happens in the book of Esther? Well, you know, they get the bad end of the stick, and they realize, you know, there's anti-Semitism there in Persia, etc. Yeah. After that comes Nehemiah. Nehemiah originally comes to the land of Israel as a Persian minister, not to settle. He is being sent as an officer of the court. But then he stays.
Right.
And he then is the one, in many ways, that it brings that transition, even so there's still a lot of people staying in Babylon and will stay there. But he changes the focus from the Jews in Babylon, Persia, which is in the book of Esther.
Right.
The focus changes back to Zion. And that's what we have at the end of you know, throughout the book of Nehemiah. And that's the Second Temple period. The Second Temple period is the rebirth of the Jewish people in the land of Israel. Most of this is post-biblical, at least post-Jewish scripture time.
Right.
There isn't a lot of detail about the Second Temple period in the Bible, but we know that Jews were here and flourished, and Babylon, nobody cared about them anymore. They were no longer the center. The center moved here.
Yeah. Despite the huge task the returning exiles had ahead of them, they left their comfortable homes in Babylon and made the long journey toward the rubble of their holy city. To see actual archaeological evidence of this time in history, I paid a visit to the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. There I had the thrilling opportunity to meet the head of the Israel Antiquities Authority's coin department, who showed me evidence of Jewish life truly reviving in the Promised Land. Well, I am in a very cool place right now with a very cool individual. This is Dr. Robert Kuhl from the Israel Antiquities Authority. Dr. Robert, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Well, it's great to have you on. And I want to ask you first about this room that we are in. This is an amazing spot.
Yeah, it's a small room with a big collection, a very important collection. Probably one of the most important scientific collections in the world. Not because I work here, but it's just like this. It basically encompasses the entire coin find collection since the early 20th century. All the coins that were found in excavations in the Holy Land, Palestine, modern Israel, it's all here.
Amazing.
They really appeared here during the Persian period. That's when people start minting coins. And actually the first, I would call, coin that is really connected to Jewish history in this part of the world is this coin. So this was the coin which was minted by the Persian authorities that were ruling in this part of the world. And what is so exceptional about this coin, it's not just a Persian coin. It really is a Jewish coin, because on the coin appear the letters Yahad in ancient Hebrew. Wow. This is the Hebrew that was used since the times of King David and Solomon, all the way to the destruction of the first temple.
Incredible.
Afterwards, actually during this period, the script starts changing, and we start using the script which we can read today, the Hebrew that you and I can read today. But this is a script, this is a different script.
Okay.
And this is the script that appears. So we really know that this coin was minted for the Jewish population and probably by the Jewish leadership in this part of the world.
So small.
It's very small, but it's very important. You can see on the side, it's very difficult to read, but you can read the letters from right to left. There are 3 letters. Difficult to read, but it's there.
Amazing. Wow. Thank you. Don't go away. When we come back, Isaac shows me more archaeological evidence of Jewish exiles returning and rebuilding Jerusalem. I was a pastor for over 20 years before I first went to Israel, only to realize that I had been totally disconnected from the roots of my faith. Since then, I've been on a journey of discovery, and my faith has come alive in ways I never could have imagined. I'm Jeff Futers, Director of First Century Foundations, and I am excited to invite you on my journey to the foundations of our faith, to discover your part in a Bible story that isn't over yet. First Century Foundations exists to reconnect Christians to the foundations of Christianity. And we do this by creating Bible-based media focused on Israel and the Jewish roots of our faith. But we don't just reconnect you to Israel's history, we help you participate in what God is doing in Israel today by connecting you to over 70 incredible ministries in Israel who desperately need our support. Will you partner with us? Together, we'll explore Israel's significant past while doing our part to ensure that Israel has a bright future. It was so fascinating to see a Jewish coin that illuminated Jewish culture being re-established in Jerusalem 2,500 years ago. It made the era of the biblical characters Ezra and Nehemiah become almost tangible for me. Now eventually, leadership changes in the Babylonian Empire, or over the Babylonian Empire, and the Jews are allowed to return under King Cyrus. Tell us a little bit about that part of the history.
So the Babylonian Empire is eventually conquered by what's the Persian Empire. The Persian and the Medians make an alliance and overthrow the Babylonians. And Cyrus, who is the emperor, issues a famous decree. We have these cylinders that are clay cylinders with cuneiform inscriptions impressed into them, kind of mirroring what you see in the book of Ezra, where Cyrus says, God has made me king over all the earth and commanded him to build a temple for him in Jerusalem. We don't have any, that doesn't appear in that cylinder, but we do know that unlike the Babylonians, who were into bringing people they conquered to their capital city, making kind of united colors of Benetton world capital, Cyrus is telling everyone, okay, previous people who were brought here by the Babylonians, you can now go back. So the Jews are one of those people. So he tells the Jews they can go back. The Jews have already been there for many, many decades and are quite comfortable there. So the Reish Galusa, who is the temporal leader of the Jewish community in exile, his name is Zerubbabel ben Shaltiel, he says, let's go back. And only 42,000 Jews go.
Right.
But that's the beginning of the return of, we have what is the second Commonwealth, as we call it, the Second Temple period begins with that decree.
So two characters, Ezra and Nehemiah, what were their roles in all of this?
Right, so both of those guys were court officials for the Babylonians and the Persians, and that's a common feature we see of history, is that the wandering Jews serves very useful purposes amongst various kings and leaders around the world, being literate and well connected, so a lot of times we end up working for these different empires. So these were court officials of the Persian Empire. Ezra comes back first, and he finds the few people had stayed in Jerusalem and Israel basically assimilated and intermarried. He, all puns intended, is responsible for rejuvenating the Jewish presence in the land of Israel. He institutes a number of decrees to re-strengthen, because the center of the Jewish world had moved to Babylon, even though spiritually it's in Jerusalem, but there's only a few Jews there with no rabbinic leadership. So he basically reestablishes the presence and reconnects people to their Judaism. They basically lost it. Nehemiah, or Nehemiah as he's called, comes later, less than 20 years later, and he also a court official, and he is responsible more for the physical reconstructions. A famous story, he walks around at night and he sees the destroyed remains of the walls of Jerusalem, because there's also threats from the Samaritans and other people. It's hard to rebuild the city when you're being attacked. How can you rebuild the temple when people are attacking you? So he's responsible for the physical reconstruction of the city. And really, Ezra is responsible for the spiritual reconstruction. So they make a great team to reestablish what is that Second Temple period.
And how well does it get rebuilt? What does Jerusalem look like after the rebuilding during this period?
So we actually know from archaeology that originally Jerusalem was the tip of Mount Moriah, and as a Canaanite city, and King David purchased the upper part of the hill. And the end of the First Temple period, the city's expanded to what is today the upper hill, which is the Jewish quarter up to Jaffa Gate. That's all destroyed. So we have remnants of the walls from the early Second Temple period that seem to be more or less built on what was the original Canaanite King David's city. And we already see by the time of a few hundred years later, the city's more or less expanded out to where it was in the end of the First Temple period. So it starts out as quite a small city, and the population is quite small, but it's sort of like the modern state of Israel. There's only 600,000 Jews in Israel in 1948, and now there's almost 7 million. So as the Jewish presence is reestablished, the population comes back, and the city will expand at various periods of time to become, by the end of the Second Temple period, the largest city in the Eastern Roman Empire, twice the size of the old city of today.
Rebuilding Jerusalem was an enormous project for the Jewish exiles who returned from Babylon. In order to visualize just how much work lay ahead of them, Isaac took me somewhere in the city of David I had never been before. Well, Isaac, where have you brought me?
Jeff, on our left-hand side, we can see the remains of the original wall of Jerusalem. So we are within the wall. Number two, over here, we can see lots of ruins. You can see the stones here, you can see right behind us, these are the ruins of the private houses of the citizens of Jerusalem who lived here during the time of the first temple.
Right.
You can see the rest of the city is on our right-hand side, on the hillside.
Right.
Now, you can see that the hill is very, very steep. So how during the time of the first temple, the people managed to build their houses? They were very clever. Over here, they built their houses like in terraces, one terrace on top of the another. So the lowest terrace or the lowest row of the houses was leaning against this wall. Now, the roofs of these houses supported the foundations of the second row of more houses. And the roofs of the houses in the second row supported the foundations of the houses in the third row, which means that the houses were built like one terrace on top of the another. So when the Babylonians came here, they understood engineering, so they knew that all they had to do was to knock down this wall.
Right.
So when they knocked down this wall, there was nothing to support the lowest row of the houses. So the lowest row of the houses collapsed, and then domino effect.
Right.
So all other houses simply collapsed, and actually one row on top of the another. Now remember that the roofs of the houses were made out of wood. Nothing is left from the wood.
Right.
So what we see today, we can see only the foundations and the remains of the floors of the houses, one on top of the another.
Incredible.
So this is indeed the very dramatic end of Jerusalem due to the Babylonian occupation, 586-87 BC. When this country became to be under the rule of the Persians, the Persian king in those days was Cyrus.
Right.
He gave a very important declaration that allowed the Jews to return back to Jerusalem. If we read the book of Nehemiah 2, over there we read something fascinating. Remember, when he came here, the city was totally destroyed.
Yes.
And Nehemiah wrote in Nehemiah 2 that late at night, he took his mule, he went out for a night inspection. Now, he wrote that he walked along the ruins of the wall, but he complained that there was not enough room for his mule to go through. Why? Because the ruins of the houses came all the way to the wall. So not enough space for his mule to walk through along this wall. So this indeed brings the Bible alive.
Sure does. That's amazing. Well, Isaac, I'd never been here before. Thank you so much for bringing me.
I am very happy. Thank you very much. My pleasure.
Jerusalem in ruins could not keep the Jewish people away from the city they knew God had chosen as His eternal dwelling place. The Jewish people did return from Babylon and began to rebuild Zion despite all opposition. God was not done with Jerusalem. God was not done with His people. He had eternal promises to keep regarding them. Jerusalem's story was not over. Thank you so much for joining me today. As we explored this intriguing time in Jerusalem's history, please join me again next time right here in God's holy city as we continue our quest to discover Jerusalem from Genesis to Jesus.